Terrific read. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ellroy Reads, the podcast where I go through a number of books that were very special in the life of James Ellroy, books that inspired him to write, that inspired the great themes and ideas that permeate through his work. This episode, we're going to do something slightly different because this episode, my choice is the wonderful non-fiction book Mrs. Paine's Garage by Thomas Mallon. Now, the reason this is different is because, firstly, it's the first non-fiction book that we've covered, and secondly, it's the first book we've covered that Ellroy read in later life. Previous episodes I've covered books such as The Digger's Game by Judge V. Higgins and The Fan Club by Irving Wallace and a few others. All of those were novels that Ellroy read before he became a professional writer, when he only had ambitions, he only had dreams. In fact, his life was often so despairing back in his youth, the drug addiction, the homelessness, the petty crime, that perhaps those dreams were more like fantasies. Perhaps there were times when he thought, I'd never really make it, but he did, and that changed the course of American history in terms of American literary history, to become one of the most famous American writers. So Mrs. Paine's Garage, despite being non-fiction, has had just as big an influence on James Ellroy's literary output. Now, there's good James Ellroy literature, such as The Black Dahlia, and then there's bad James Ellroy literature, such as, just to pick one example, Kay Lake's diary entries in Perfidia. But Mrs. Paine's Garage has influenced James Ellroy's output both retrospectively and in terms of where he's continued to go forward. So it tells the story of Ruth Paine, who is a fascinating woman. She's a Quaker activist, an educator, and she was a friend and acquaintance of Marina Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald. Her friendship was really with Marina, and she kind of knew Lee Harvey Oswald by default. But Thomas Mallon tells the story of Ruth Paine in that he tells her backstory, her faith, her Quakerism, her marriage to Michael Paine, who was a very interesting man because he was an inventor himself. He worked for Bell Helicopter. In fact, his stepfather invented the Bell Helicopter, and his father was an architect and left-wing activist. And Michael Paine was American blue blood. But when they were living in Dallas, Ruth and Michael Paine, they had a rather strained marriage that ended in divorce, sadly. But they had a wonderful friendship, and in many ways that undermined the marriage, because they actually said retrospectively it was more of a friendship than a marriage. They were rather isolated. Quakerism was in Dallas was seen as something of a sect. Plus, they were liberals. They were on the political left, which today in Dallas it will probably put you somewhat on the fringes of society. But back in the late 50s, 1960s, it put you very much on the fringes. So the Quaker organization that Ruth Paine was associated with organized some kind of pen pal programs with the Soviet Union, and in a slight thawing of relations, an East-West exchange program where several Soviet citizens came over to the US, to Dallas. Some of them, the Russian emigre community in Dallas included some colourful and notable characters. George D. Morenschild, I think I've pronounced that correctly, I probably haven't, who was an associate of the Bush family, and a lot of conspiracists have talked a lot about him. And Ruth wanted to improve her Russian language skills and wanted to become fluent in Russian, and that's how she befriended Marina Oswald early in 1963. Now, the reason this book is so significant to Ellroy is it was published in 2002, and Ellroy read it a few years later. By the late noughties, Ellroy had given up on the conspiracy theories that had permeated through his fiction. In Ellroy's most famous novel, American Tabloid, arguably his most famous, it's written from the point of view of the conspirators who came to assassinate President Kennedy, or were involved either tangentially or directly. And Ellroy's own view was, for many years, that Kennedy was killed as part of some sort of free-floating conspiracy between the mob, the mafia, rogue CIA agents, and right-wing Cuban exiles. He never really explained it or fleshed out that theory particularly well. In fact, he did it very well in fiction through implication. But that seemed to be his objective analysis, that he did not believe that someone like Lee Harvey Oswald could have killed JFK, President Kennedy, acting alone. But this book converted him to the lone gunman theory. We'll get into why in just a minute, but I should go through some backstory and say that Thomas Mallon and James Ellroy are now very, very close friends. I'm very pleased to say that I know them both. I only know Thomas Mallon a little bit, but I know James Ellroy very well as his biographer. They first met in the 90s when Mallon was a literary editor for GQ, and Ellroy was GQ's star columnist. But ironically, they didn't know each other very well at that time, other than professionally. Their friendship took off much later when Mallon became very interested. Ellroy became very interested in Mallon's novels and his literary output. He admired the novel Watergate. He admired Mallon's historical fiction greatly, and Mallon is an absolutely fantastic writer. So when he got round to read Mrs. Paine's Garage, it's fair to say that Ellroy was already having doubts about the whole conspiracy theory world. He would have been in his late 50s, early 60s, but by this time, and he was just feeling his age in this world, which increasingly with the internet is more geared towards younger, impressionable people. And I think what really converted him, and this is around the time that he and Mallon became really, really close friends, but what really converted him is just, this book has just this overwhelming humanism to it. The focus on the domestic life of Ruth Paine, like I say, her marriage, her friendship with Marina, she wasn't really friends with Lee, she was just kind of in his orbit, is that it's just endlessly fascinating as ordinary lives are. And these were kind of people who were ordinary but were also extraordinary in the way that I'm sure you know people who've done extraordinary things, who've travelled, who've achieved extraordinary things, but they're not household names or anything. The drama of their lives, which is rooted in this kind of very, very earthiness, that's what really comes through in this book, Mrs. Paine's Garage. So Mallon first got the idea for the book, or at least the idea to write about Ruth Paine in the mid-90s, and he pitched the idea to her. He wanted to do it as a series of articles for the New Yorker. In that, Ruth Paine has been very, very candid about all of her experiences with the Oswalds over the years. She's given television interviews, she's taken part in mock trials, one of which was filmed here in the UK, and her attitude is, I want to impart the history, I want to educate people. Or she's always been very, very consistent in her view that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and she's tried to debunk any conspiracy theory, although she has been roped in to a number of conspiracy theories herself, and has been accused of some pretty awful things. But one thing that comes through in Mallon's portrayal of her is her humanity. She's very, very patient with that sort of thing. She has a wonderful sense of humor. It's sometimes a slightly jarring sense of humor. He talks about a slightly high-pitched laugh, and her ability to laugh at somewhat inappropriate times, which occasionally throws people. So Mallon said, I want to write something with a more essayist approach, a more humanist approach, because all of the books, whether they were pro-conspiracy theory or anti-conspiracy theory, all tended to write about the assassination as an investigation, as a mystery to be solved, as a conspiracy to be debunked. And he wanted to write something that was much more empathetic towards the people involved. And by this stage, she originally said, no, I'm not so much interested in that. I'm just an observer. I don't want the book to be about me. Then around about 1999, 2000, she began to change her mind, and they'd stayed in touch. They began to have very, very long interviews and conversations, many of which are recorded here, not quite verbatim, but there's a kind of free-flowing style. Mallon, really brings you into the story, picks up a voice, she picks it up here, picks it up there, and can jump from subject to subject. And it's all rather wonderful, really. The front cover features an absolutely remarkable photograph in that it's the day after the assassination, and here you have Oswald's mother, Marguerite, holding his baby daughter. You have his older daughter. You have Marina Oswald, and you have Ruth Paine in the kitchen doing all sorts of domestic tasks. And very small in the corner, you can see a newspaper, a couple of days old, talking about Kennedy's visit to Dallas. So the overwhelming domesticity of the story kind of makes any thought of a conspiracy just void, because you're wrapped up in just how ordinary it all seems, how completely banal it is. It does go into fascinating detail and fascinating trivia. So if you're interested in the assassination of JFK and you're watching this, which I imagine is pretty much everybody, we're all interested. You may be particularly interested in something that's been overlooked. For instance, Oswald's attempted assassination of General Edwin Walker, who was we call him today a Trumpian figure, a right-wing rabble-rouser, and something of a local celebrity in Dallas. And Oswald, as it goes into in this book, took great pains, went to a great extent of planning and preparation to murder this man. And it was kind of only afterwards that, by accident, kind of Ruth Paine almost uncovered this by passing on a book which featured a letter to Marina, giving her instructions on what to do if I'm killed or captured. And then, in just one of those ironies of ironies, Walker survived the assassination attempt. The bullet grazed him, and the Dallas police didn't have any suspects until after the assassination of Kennedy. Oswald was keeping the Carcano rifle that shot Kennedy in Ruth Paine's garage, hence the title here, Mrs. Paine's Garage. He probably only decided to kill Kennedy that morning on a whim. He wanted to kill somebody. As Thomas Mallon said, if Khrushchev had been visiting Dallas on a state visit, he probably would have taken a shot at Khrushchev. He took a shot at Walker, who was ultra right-wing, but he finally killed JFK, a Liberal president. He injured Governor Connolly in the car. He murdered J.D. Tippit, who was trying to arrest him. He was an incredibly loner, loser, malcontent. He was an incredibly dull and banal man, despite being kind of nominally fascinating, having defected to the Soviet Union, having served as a Marine, having come back and ultimately having killed the president. He was an incredibly dull man. It even goes into some details. He wasn't very good in bed, and the Marina and Lee had a very unhappy marriage in almost every regard, and it goes into those kind of domestic details. And the book is very important. So in terms of how it affects Ellroy, it's just like, I think a lot of Ellroy's readership might be conspiracy theory minded, and I think I was, especially when I first read American Tabloid. It was actually the first Ellroy novel I read. And Ellroy deliberately pitched the novel as alternative history, which is very much one of the great themes of his work, of his best work. He pitched it as, this could be the inside scoop. And a lot of people bought that. I'm not saying Ellroy did anything duplicitous or anything. I think these sorts of kind of literary games are very important, especially if you want to make your mark. And he wanted to avoid, everybody's written about the Kennedy assassination. How do I do it differently? Well, he'd been greatly influenced by Libra by Don DeLillo, which he thinks is a marvelous book, and it is. I'm sure we'll cover it in a future episode. And of course, that is a wonderful fictional portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald. So Ellroy deliberately excluded Oswald from his story, and he deliberately excluded the Jim Garrison investigation and the trial of Clay Shaw from his story because that had been done at great lengths by Oliver Stone. Um, by the way, if you want a debunking of Jim Garrison's investigation and also a vindication of the character of Clay Shaw, read this book, Mrs. Payne's Garage, because it says that it was the Garrison's investigation was a grotesque travesty of justice on many, many levels. And Clay Shaw was actually suing Garrison at the time. Shaw died of lung cancer. The case was dropped. The charges, it said the lawsuit was dropped. And then other details that Mallon goes into are the modern conspiracy theorists, the internet, how these things spread like wildfire. Obviously, he doesn't have much time for conspiracy theorists, and there's a lot of ugliness on the internet. A lot of conspiracy theorists can be anti-Semitic, they can be misogynistic, they can be lots of ugly things. But at the same time, he does say, why, oh why do decent, rational people who live good lives, who raise families, who have good jobs, why do they fall for a lot of this bunkum? There's one bit where there's a conspiracy theorist convention, and one of the people speaking is actually a retired English policeman who was obviously fascinated. He'd been to Helsinki. He'd stayed at the hotel that Oswald stayed in the night before he defected to the Soviet Union, and the obsession with minutiae and detail and trivia that really probably started with Oliver Stone's JFK. I think the conspiracy theories have been around a lot longer than that, but if Oliver Stone's JFK hadn't have come along, it wouldn't have been such a industry. In fact, maybe there wouldn't have been so many conspiracy theories about Roswell and I don't know, a bomber, a bit of birtherism and a bomber's birth certificate and all of that. It almost created an industry into itself, and it did some good things, like it forced the government to release some of the records, which again are overwhelming with detail, but rather dull. So this book kind of changed Ellroy. It veered him away from kind of conspiracy theory and towards hopefully just still very, very convoluted plotting, but a more realistic view of history, perhaps more rooted back in his personal experience, more rooted back in Los Angeles, rather than the national scale and the national arena that he'd embraced in the Underworld USA trilogy. So it had a profound effect on him. And then there's a good story here, because yes, we tend to be the most formulated by what we experience in our youth. The music we listen to, the films we absorb, the books that we read have a much bigger impact on us in our youth when we're our most impressionable, when our brains are just like sponges taking everything in. We hit middle age, we get cynical, we lose the time to really take these things in, or we look at things too clinically or too academically. And yet, this book, Mrs. Payne's Garage, really converted Ellroy. And even if it doesn't convert you from, even if it doesn't set you on some Damascene road, it's still a terrific read. And like I say, it's quietly working away at you, and is just a marvelous read. So I'm going to have to say that Ellroy Reads, this is my recommendation, my first non-fiction recommendation on Ellroy Reads, Mrs. Payne's Garage by Thomas Mallon. I'd recommend it strongly. It wasn't a bestseller, so the chances are perhaps you haven't read it, and maybe you haven't even heard of it, but you should go out and... Oh, what's this? Phone call. Hello? Oh, hello, James. What? No, I never made a crack at Perfidia. No? No K-Lake's diary entries. Oh, no, well, they weren't my favourite, but I think in the course of a long literary career like you've had, James, I think obviously you're going to have a few bits that don't work so well. Oh, no, really, James, there's no need for talk like that. No, James, hello? Oh. Looks like I got my work cut out for me. Okay, well, it's his birthday in a couple of days. Maybe I better send him a nice gift. Okay, so I'll get back to burning bridges. I'll get back to building bridges or rebuilding bridges with James. Meantime, you go out and buy Mrs. Paine's Garage. It'll give you a wonderful read this weekend. Okay, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.